you really got to want to be a writer. You really, to do this, whether it's screenwriting or anything else, and it really doesn't matter what other people think. I think you're driven to do this. It's almost as bad as being an actor. You almost have to be sick to do it. I think it helps if you're a little broken to do these things, that you are trying to fill in something in your soul that isn't there, or whatever that is. I think that's what drives people on to do this stuff. And, well, let's see, eventually I will peter out here and we will talk, but I wrote some things down that I was going to say today. And you must take them all with a big grain of salt, because I'm not sure how much I believe you can teach writing. I think you have to teach yourself. And I think that now, when I started out, there were no screenwriting books, and now there are shelves of them. And I'm very suspicious of them, I think. And yet, there's probably some good ones out there. In fact, I have one I might even recommend to you eventually here. But that said, I think writing, and again, I'm going to talk mostly about screenwriting, but this probably applies to any kind of writing or any kind of artistic endeavor. But I think that screenwriting requires vision, stamina, and courage, if you want to get simple. And by vision, I mean you have to have a story you want to tell. And it has to be a story that you think is worth telling. And it ought to be a story that you really, really like, because it's not that easy to sit down and write a story. It's very hard to get a movie made. For those of you who have made one in here, you know what I'm talking about. And if you are 2 years down the line and you're standing on a set and everything is going wrong, and you don't like that story, then you've really put yourself in a bind. So even to get to that point, though, as a writer, you're going to have to go through quite a bit of hard work. So you should like that story. You should have a vision for it, and you should have a vision for what it can be. And that sort of brings me to stamina, because you also have to hold on to that vision and not let go of it through the many parts of the process that you'll go through. Because it takes a long time to write a script, and that's why it takes stamina to keep going. And it takes a long time to come up with a story. It also takes stamina to get up on a bad day and do a good day's work. And that's really, I think, when you become, a lot of people kind of go along and one day they have a success, sort of what happened to me, and suddenly they're a writer. Well, they're not really a writer. Now they're going to find out what it is to be a writer. And what it means to be a writer is often that you have to get up every day, usually working on something, if you're working for money, which is always a mistake, by the way, that you don't really like. And you have to invest in that somehow and make it work. I recommend, basically, that you should only write on things you want to write on. Unfortunately, very few people will pay you to do that. So you end up doing some other things sometimes, too. And I think, finally, courage is the most important thing, because you really need the courage of your convictions, and you've got to stick with it, no matter what your father might think you're doing, or your friends, or you give your script to your girlfriend and she says it's terrible. You have to believe that what you're doing is good. You have to be able to listen, as Mr. Kipling would say, to the doubters, but you have to keep going and sticking to yourself. You have to have the courage, I think, most importantly, to fail. You have to be able to fail, and you have to get up from your failures. But you don't learn anything except by failure. And you have to be willing to sort of throw yourself out on the line and do things that are startling and new and audacious. Otherwise, you're going to make the same old pablum everybody's going to make. And if you do that, you're going to fail sometimes. You're going to be embarrassed. And yet you just kind of have to do that, because otherwise, how are you going to write something that's interesting and vital and vigorous? I think you have to have the courage to be ambivalent and in this process. And I'll talk more about what I mean by ambivalence. But basically, it means that you're not going to solve everything all the time. And you can't give up because you can't solve it. You have to say, well, maybe, I'll think about it later. The solution will come. And I think that often when people don't have ambivalence, they will throw out a good idea or rush to solve it in a bad way. I think you have to have the courage and the stamina to keep rewriting, to not say it's done yet. I think one of the best things that ever happened to me over 10, 12 years of doing this, or it's actually longer now, is you have the courage to throw things out, even things you adore. You go, oh, well, that was nice, and it doesn't matter because you realize you can write it again. You can write something else. You can get it back. But that takes courage at first, because I think when you first start out, you feel like you're going to lose something, or it might screw it up, or something like that. And I think most of all that writing is really an act of faith, because it's an act of faith in yourself, and it's an act of faith that it will work out, can work out. I imagine a number of you have heard of Campbell's hero's, Journey of the Hero. This gets a lot of play these days, ever since Mr. Lucas said that it was the basis for what he did. And there's even a screenwriting book now, I think by Christopher Vogler, called The Screenwriter's Journey, which sort of puts this down in formula and makes it easy to digest. It's not actually a bad book, but former script analyst, which I did for 5 years, and making some money now as a consultant, as a guy teaching people how to write the screenplays. I always question, though, like, can you really teach someone how to write a screenplay if you haven't written one yourself? But I'm not sure if a guy who's written a screenplay can teach you how to write a screenplay, because, as I said, I think you have to teach yourself. Anyway, this idea of Campbell's journey of the hero, I think it's nowhere better illustrated than in the act of sitting down to write something like a screenplay, which is a long form, or a novel, or anything that takes a while. Because you start out with this wonderful idea, this adventure you're going to go on, and usually at the moment when you can't go back, it all falls apart in front of you, and you are screwed, and you have to keep going. And essentially, if you succeed, you're kind of a different person by the other end of it. And you really can't ever see the end of the tunnel. You can't really see the end of the adventure. You'd like to think you could. But you have to go through this process. And innate in that process is fear. And we'll get to fear in a second. And you have to face that, and you have to face your own fear. And the really bad news is it never goes away. You'll never achieve, I don't think, if you're a good writer, the idea that the blank page will not frighten you, that the new project will not frighten you. It's always there. But we'll talk about that in a second. So what does a screenwriter do? Well, writing is writing. I think that you can learn a lot about writing by reading any good author, whatever they're doing. And I think that the processes that they go through, whether it's Hemingway or Faulkner or Stephen King, are very similar after a while. When you read enough about writers, you see, well, there's some sort of similarity here. It's better if you have good work habits. It's better if you do it every day. Most of them generally have substance abuse problems, you find out over time. And you wonder, why is that? Well, it seems to go with the artistic temperament, or maybe it's all that time alone. Most of them get over it if they don't die, which is also a good thing. But screenwriting is different in a way from other writing, I think, in certain ways, because some people don't really recognize screenwriting as real writing. In fact, a lot of people say, well, it's not really writing because it's not the finished product. In fact, it's a blueprint for something else. And I think that, at least for screenwriters, that's not a good thing. Well, you hear it, but it's not a good thing to think, because in a way, you are writing something that is its own form. And it's starting, I think, to be, maybe because there's all these screenwriting books, it's starting to be looked at now as less, I think it was seen as a lesser form, looked down on by novelists in particular, and by playwrights. But many of those people, you notice, come out to Hollywood and fail miserably at this. And why is that? Screenwriting is not just about people talking. It's not just dialogue. And what I think a lot of people want to say to a screenwriter is, oh, all you're here for and all you care about is your dialogue. And that might be something left over from the idea of screenwriter as playwright. But in fact, I don't think that's what the job of the screenwriter is. I think it's about 20% of your job, really. I think your job is much bigger than that. I think that screenwriting, more than other forms, is kind of like haiku. You don't have the amount of space. You don't have some of the same tools as the novelist does. You can't say, and then he thought. Unless you want to do a voiceover, and that has its limitations. It's got to be essentially essentially visual. These days, you're not allowed to, thanks to Cashiers du Cinema and Andrew Saris, who screwed it all up and said it was all the director, which, it didn't used to be, by the way. Before the World War II, it was all the producer. And then after World War II, it became kind of the movie stars, which it still is, by the way. But somewhere in there, the French came along and invented the auteur theory. And but before that happened, you used to be able to write angles, and you used to be able to say specifically, and they would write very precise scripts, camera angle by camera angle. But that has been taken away from the writer, and maybe that's okay. But I think nonetheless, you still have to say to yourself, you have to know what the story you're telling is from a visual standpoint. So, that said, the great training for screenwriting is production. And to think of yourself as separate from that in this business, I think is a mistake. I think some of the greatest things I learned were by taking an editing class or two, by being on a set and seeing what happens and what works and what doesn't. And that opens your eyes to things, and then you start watching movies in a different way. And I think you always have to think about yourself as, a filmmaker when you're writing a screenplay. And if you're successful at this, even if you're not writing camera angles, you start to realize what is the point, what is most essential in a scene visually. What will the shot be? And one of the great fun I have is sometimes I'm writing a sequence and eventually a director will have to storyboard it. And I can go through the storyboards, and if they're a good director, they will have their own wonderful additions, but I can also go, there's that shot, there's that shot. And they are literally composing shots that were not specified as such, but that's the only way you can do it because that's the way the scene is written. And the reason it's the only way you can do it is because it's about narrative. And it's integrated into the narrative. Everything is moving in one direction. And if that's done well, all the pieces are going to fit. And I think that you have to think about these things in terms of what the camera sees and how you can see it and how the camera will reveal it. And this is the thing that makes screenwriting different from every other kind of writing. So I would say that instead of reading a lot of screenwriting books, which there are some that are helpful, or worrying about that, you should really, sort of get out and start looking at the world visually and start to look at how directors, the really great directors, will reveal a character, have a character enter, see how a line can be the key part of a scene and how that's visually enhanced. I think it's really good to sort of get books on production and how that works. I think it's very good. I just bought a book today here because it looked kind of interesting to me, because storyboarding is fairly important, and so I bought this book on storyboarding. And it's not like I'm going to become a storyboard artist, but that's a way to think about movies, and it's a way that I think about sequence then, because what I'm really trying to do is create a great sequence where you see this, and then you see this, and then it builds to that, and those are the important things that make it exciting for someone to watch. As I said, I believe we all I think you have to teach yourself how to write. I don't think you can, because it's a very personal thing, and if you're going to be good at it, you can sit down for a little while and you can get some help, but you can't really, there's no magic formula. So I think you have to really sit down and figure it out for yourself. Now the way I did it was, it was terrifying to me and it was very mysterious. And what I was lucky enough to do was, after I got out of film school, having had no money, you have to have money to make films, I decided, well, I probably should be a screenwriter because, you don't have to have money to do that. Then I thought, but my God, you're going to have to go deal with the studios, and these people truly frighten me. So I thought, well, I should get a job at a studio, find out what that's like, And this is what I did. I got a job as a story analyst, and I was in the Story Analyst Guild, which is an IATSE guild actually. And this was actually back in the good old days when you could actually make a living doing this. And however, I must say, one caveat being it has the highest suicide rate of any guild in the IATSE. And that's because you are trapped in a little room reading mostly awful stuff. And you desperately want to do something else different, and no one will let you, and no one will take you seriously. That said, for about 4 years, I was a miserable guy reading scripts for Paramount and then Columbia Studios. And I probably read 4,000 scripts. And I think what I learned was, by osmosis, I learned some things. And that's a good thing to think about. I think I could have done that more quickly. I don't know if I would have, because I'm lazy. If I just sat down and read good screenplays. I don't think I needed to read so many bad screenplays. It's good to read bad screenplays because you can see, you learn something really. One thing I did learn about being a reader was, you fucking hate these people who are writing scripts. You know, this is like the 400th bad script. I've just had a bad day. I'm coming to work, and you want me to read this. Now, I really want to be a writer, but I'm not, so fuck you. And I'm going to read your script. Fuck you. Now, and it better not be bad. Oh, fuck you. And now, what you're really doing as a screenwriter, what I realize is you gotta write past that, because unless the guy or the girl is really a terrible person, they also love what they do. They're looking for a good movie, and they'll give you about 10 pages, and after that, they're skipping to 40, and they're looking at the end, and they're going, okay, how can I get around reading the rest of this? And they're reading your dialogue, which means all the real work you've done, all that sort of polish and all the little finesse has been missed. So you really have to grab them, and you have to get past that bad day and their resentment, and they have to be inspired. And by the way, this is a good way to think about the movie audience too. I mean, Hollywood, and I think as we get and become more sophisticated and think ourselves as this elite and intelligent group, we start to think that the audience is stupid, and Hollywood will pander to that, and the marketing departments will pander to that too. Well, they're not too smart. Now, they're very smart, and they're very sophisticated. I think what you can say is they kind of like their entertainment, and they like it a certain way, and they don't want it to be too fancy. And I remember when we first did our first test screening of RoboCop, I was amazed at how willing they were to love this picture, like before the picture started. They just wanted it to be good. Now, luckily, there was a joke, and then some cool things happened, and they went with it. But I think that they will also turn on you in about 10 minutes or 5 if it is not good. Because remember, you are the generation, particularly the younger people in here, who just have grown up absolutely bombarded, feeding on media. So you guys have it in your veins. You know, you guys know what's going to happen. You guys have seen the stories. And it's really up to the writer then, and the director too, to tell that story, because there aren't that many ways to skin the cat, to tell that story in a neat and new way, from a personal perspective, because of what's happening around them in the world. And if you don't do that, the audience is going to say, hey, we're bored, and we're disappointed, and we're not entertained. And that's really what they want. Anyway, back to screenwriting. So you got to get past that reader guy, because that reader guy is mad at you, and he doesn't want to read your script, really, you know. And so that's one thing I learned out of that process was, boy, I've got to write this up to a certain level so that I can get past me on a bad day, you know. And that was probably a good experience. I do think that I learned more from reading good screenplays than from bad screenplays. And it's easy to find bad screenplays. Just ask any of your friends and you'll get some. Or go back and look at some of your own. That's what I do. Good screenplays are out there now, and that's another nice thing that wasn't available. I mean, you can get them off the internet, but you can just go down and pick up books and read good screenplays of movies that are good. And I would recommend getting those screenplays and then getting the movie and reading the screenplay and watching the movie, and then go back and look at that screenplay. And then, if you want to borrow a trick from Raymond Chandler, the way he taught himself to write at the advanced age of about 55 after he was a failed oil executive, was he outlined an Earl Stanley Gardner story and rewrote it himself, just to see what that was like. And you'll learn a lot in construction by doing those kind of things. In other words, go rent a movie that you like. Go get the screenplay. If there's a book that underlines that material, get the book. And then outline those things and see how they did it. It's sort of the way, you know, it's like taking it apart and putting it back together again. You'll learn a huge amount by doing that and comparing it. And those are the things you can do yourself if you have the motivation and the discipline to do it, as opposed to, you know, someone like me who had to be drugged through 4 years of bad road as a story analyst. There really aren't any formulas, and you learn best to write by writing. I think that's the other thing that I probably would do differently now. You learn best to write by sitting down and writing. You're not gonna. It's not like you wait and one day it's going to happen. You have to write, and confront the fact that it's terrible. I haven't really met too many people who are writers of note who like writing. Hemingway used to say, "It's nice to have written." I think that that's really true. Anytime I meet somebody who says, "Oh, I love to write," I kind of go, "Don't ask me to read your writing because I don't think it's going to be that good." Now, there's probably some exceptions to that rule, but the fear of the blank page is very real and it never goes away. I mean, that's the bad news. I thought, if I write a movie and it's a success, well, suddenly I'll know it. Well, boy, that's not true. You don't know it. In fact, that reminds me of a story, actually. We are in this is in 1996, we are in Casper, Wyoming. I'm staying at a Hilton that's not quite as nice as the one I'm staying at now, and we are in the back of a black Lincoln Town car, and we are driving 40 miles outside of Casper to a place called Hell's Half Acre. We're making Starship Troopers. And it's on the first day of photography, it's the principal of photography. There's 600 people there. It's this huge army of production. And the director, Mr. Verhoeven, is in a foul and awful mood. So much so that you don't even want to talk to him because, and I understand why to some extent, but I understood better later. And so I'm talking with his assistant, Stacy Lumbreezer, nice girl, who wants also to be a screenwriter and was struggling to get through her first script. And she had forgotten that 10 years earlier I had written RoboCop, I guess. And she said, "Well, Ed, you've done it. Now you've done it. Now you know how to do it." And I said, the problem is by the time this is all done, I will have forgotten how I did it. And Mr. Verhoeven came out of his very sour mood for a moment. He said, kind of in a really sort of sad and pained way, he said, "That's what always happens." And I think that was a revelation for me because I didn't know that happened to, world-class film geniuses too. But that's the thing. You don't ever hold on to that. You learn little things, but you don't hold on to some essence that says, now you can go do it again. Which brings me to the point of terror and the use of terror in our medium. As I say, the fear of the blank page never goes away. I think it shouldn't go away. And I think that terror keeps you honest and makes your work vital. It's good to be a little afraid of what you're doing. If you're not, it either means certainly when you start out, ignorance, blissful ignorance is very useful, and you can do amazing things with it. But after that, you will experience terror. And if you don't have terror, then I think, that's the surest road to hackdom. Then you are doing the same old thing. And whenever I meet somebody, usually it's a director who says, "Oh, I know how to do that. That's easy." Well, then I'm going to see a Richard Donner picture. Then I'm going to see some piece of shit that is not going to be original. That's going to be the same old, same old. And I think that you're not doing anything new. You're not doing anything fun. Maybe you're going to make some money, but you're not going to add to the canon. You're not going to inspire anybody. And so you should be afraid. And by the way, everybody is. Who does this kind of thing. Experience is really learning how to live with that, and sort of learning to tell yourself it'll be okay. Oh, I've been here before. Yeah, it doesn't feel very good. It'll be okay. Oh, this is terrible. Yeah, I've been here before. Well, you have to get over this hump, and that's what experience gets you more than anything else. The little that I've had. I think you can get an instinct for what will and won't work, and it's based primarily on where you have failed. Again, failure being very important. So let's talk about experience. What is experience? You're never going to know enough. You're never going to learn enough. So you have to keep teaching yourself about writing. I think it's an endless process, which I think is also the good news. I think the nicest thing about this business and about film, and Akira Kurosawa said, before he died, that I could go on learning about this medium for another 100 years. I'm misquoting it, but it's more or less true, that you can never learn enough about this stuff, and that's fascinating. And I think, I believe you shouldn't retire. I think when people retire, they die somehow. And so the idea that I could just keep on learning about this, that there are endless things to learn and do, is to me a wonderful thing. I think I've learned a lot about the necessity of ambivalence, and then I said I was going to talk about this at a certain point. So I guess I will. What do I mean by ambivalence? There's various authors talk about this in different ways. And what I mean by it is the ability or the developing the ability to hold a problem in your mind without necessarily having to solve it. And this is something that you see a lot of people, it's like they just don't, they get impatient. They just want it to work. And if you do that, as I said earlier, you're going to eliminate things that might be good if you did. Just say, no, I want to keep trying to solve that problem. Or you're going to solve it in a bad way. And it'll be a cheat, or it'll just be crappy. And so you really need to be able to sit with things and go, one day I will get the answer to this. And I won't settle for it unless I do. Sometimes you have to abandon things. But generally, I think when you're on to a project that you love and that you have some sort of inspiration for, those projects will lead you to the answers if you are able to sit with that ambivalence. Studio executives are not ambivalent. They don't want to hear about that. They just want you to hurry up. And so you have to resist them. Research is really, sometimes it's necessary. But you know what? It's one of the greatest forms of procrastination a writer has. I'm not ready to write. I need to do some more research. Boy, have I done that. And there are, obviously if you're writing about something, you could say if you're writing about something you don't know anything about, should you even be trying to write about it? Maybe you should write about things you have some feeling for. But I actually discovered something, probably because I was under a deadline. Or maybe because I decided one day I would just make it up. I don't know about this, I'll just make it up. Now, by the way, what I do is I'm paid to make things up, and that's what we want to do, right? Well, what I found out since then is about 95% of the time I'm completely accurate. I shock myself that that's how things are done in whatever I'm making up. And you can clean up that other stuff later on. And you can be sure as you get to production, somebody will come up and punch you in the nose and say, that's not accurate. But it's astounding how close you can be if you just make it up. And I think it's it's really good exercise just to make things up. By the way, there's really a good relationship between what we do and lying. So if you were good liars as children, just, bring that back, I'm serious. Like, what makes a good lie? Think about that. And that's kind of what you're doing. As you know, most good lies contain mostly truth. I learned, when I was, because my parents were both teachers, they were English teachers. I have a fear of English teachers to this day. I don't like grammarians. I don't like people who bust you on your spelling. I've learned sort of to become a good speller, and I do like my documents to not be too shoddy. But as a result, words like plot and character and things like that just scared the bejesus out of me. I didn't know what, someone said, what's a character? I'd go, I don't know what it is. And how does that work? I don't know, my God. And that probably kept me away from writing for 2 years, that alone. What I decided eventually was that character is really kind of human psychology. And why do people do things is what I was led to believe was the way you did this stuff. Would someone do that? Would it be natural? I mean, when you see a movie and somebody does something in the movie and you go, they never did, they wouldn't have done that, you're thrown out of the movie, first of all, which is a bad thing. And you basically are recognizing that the psychological motivations for these characters aren't accurate. So I think that whatever you want someone to do, whatever genre you're asking them to do, there should be a psychological truth to what the character is doing. And that's character. There's different ways to reveal it, obviously. But if it's just kind of how people would act within the naturalism of your movie, whatever that is. I mean, if it's giant bugs in outer space, that's one form of thing. And if it's a kitchen sink drama, that's another thing. And the thing that another thing that I think is very important about screenwriting, it's important in other forms of writing too, but I think it's very key in screenwriting, and because you don't have that much time. It's really 2 hours. And good screenwriting, I think, has a lot to do with good structure. And that was another thing that just threw me for a loop. What does structure mean? Oh my God, what is structure? And how do you structure something? And what I discovered, and this was back before there were screenwriting books, was a book by Lehos Egri, which was a book on playwrights, writing the stage. It was called The Art of Dramatic Writing. And I think I read 3 chapters, which was good for me, that far into a book. But I really only needed to read the first thing he wrote, because his whole theme was, his whole premise, actually, was that writing, that premise is everything. That everything must go to premise. And he would actually have you state the premise of what you're writing in, hopefully, 3 words, maybe a sentence, but no longer. Love conquers all, you would say, is a premise. I decided at that point, I was writing RoboCop, and I said, what was it? Man overcomes technology was my premise. That was what I was working to. And he argued that nothing should be in a play, and I would say screenplay, that does not serve that premise. And I think he's absolutely right. Everything should be taken out that doesn't go to that, and everything that does go to that and supports it belongs in. And if you do that, the way I think about it now is it's sort of like the what holds your story up. It's like a tree, and every branch should go to the trunk. Branches that don't go to the trunk, what happens to them? They die. They're not there. What the hell is that? The tree falls over. And so the more it feeds to premise, or what is actually known as theme. That's a big word that also used to scare me. But if it's thematic, what's this about? If you know what it's about, and everything you do feeds what's this about, you're going to have a well-structured book. You can't help but have it, because there's not going to be any parts rattling around that aren't supposed to be there. Let's see. A few words. I mean, screenwriting books. Again, I don't know. I have a disdain for them, and yet I pick them up obsessively and look at them, and then usually don't buy them. There is one book recently I did buy, kind of for 2 reasons. It was called, and I saw it out here today. It's called How Not to Write a Screenplay, and I sort of picked it up and looked at it like, what's this? And I started looking at it, and then a terrible, shocking thing happened. I was paging through it, and I started reading a little piece of script they had in it, and it was horrifying, because it was my first draft. It was a script, an early draft of RoboCop. It was and so I'm thinking, oh my God, what does this mean? How not to write a screenplay? Now, luckily, it was.
You have arrived when you are part of an instruction.
Well, luckily he was not using my script as an example of what not to do. Actually, it was a kind of a nice example. So, wow, what a book. But the point is, I actually took it home and then started to look at it, and I thought that the guy who also has written and has done a lot of story analysis stuff, it's the best way to look at kind of what it, to get that sense of that angry reader, because it's basically all these things we don't like, and some kind of good practical advice about what I would say is, with a film, you'll often see things when you read scripts where somebody will say something. I'm trying to give a good example, and you just know if you've made a film, you'll never get that. You'll never see that. How do you prove that? Because basically, the camera has to see it, and so it's the kind of the difference between a book and the literary idea, and a film idea, which is very visceral. You got to be able to grab it and see it, and so things like that you can learn from that. That said, I think that there's this notion that there's like these formulas and these 27 steps or 77 steps or whatever is, it's probably interesting to run those things through your mind, but I don't think that, and play with them, but I don't think that ultimately they're going to help you that much. I think really looking at a good screenplay, figuring out how they did it, thinking about the 3-act structure, things like that are good to know. Now, one of the first things I ever heard that helped me when I was really trying to figure out how to write RoboCop was somebody told me that Billy Wilder, who is one of my big heroes, and by the way, I would recommend looking at Billy Wilder's films. I mean, that guy really did a good job in almost every way, particularly with about 4 or 5 of his movies, when he was really in the middle of his career, writing and directing them. And he said that writing a screenplay was simple, but he was fooling you when he said that, because he knew it was hard too. But he said it was 1, 2, 3, and he defined that. It was a movie he made later on, not one of my favorites of his, but I think that was a thing that he used to think about a lot, which is why that movie was called 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3 was problem, complication, resolution, and that was, if there's a formula, that was his, I guess. And it really is true. The first act and the second act and the third act are problem, complication, and resolution. And the structures of individual character arcs and scenes should have a structure like that too. Really, every scene should have a 1, 2, 3 of it. A problem, a complication, and a resolution. Or a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so one of the things I think you can really do is start to just break it down that way. And almost everything in a script, I think, or in a movie, should be at least set up. So that's a 1 and a 2 structure. And I'm not trying to make it sound so simplistic here, but in a way, RoboCop was written, it was important for me to define it as in simple terms, and that's how RoboCop was written. It was almost as an experiment. I didn't think anybody would make it. And it was written as an experiment in structure. Let's see what it is, how often I'll do 1, 2, 3 within, certainly in RoboCop you'll see it's literally divided into 3 acts by those things we called the media breaks. And they literally, it's problem, complication. The first act is the problem. Well, you know, they have this problem in Old Detroit. There's crime. Oh, the big robot doesn't work. There's a problem. Yeah, but where's the problem? Our hero gets shot to pieces. He's been turned into a robot. The complication of the second act is, for the protagonist, is he remembers who he is. And he experiences the tragedy of what he's lost. And also, there's other problems that are happening there too. They're trying to kill him and things are, whatever. And the resolution is how that is successfully brought to a conclusion. And I really found that playing with things just almost mathematically, and in Starship Troopers you'll see that the hero is done with math. He's no good at math. He's done with numbers, he says, which is not in the book. I added it because I'm really dumb with math. And of course, Johnny Rico, therefore, because in the movie version, is sentenced to go off to the infantry because he's done with math. But nonetheless, that said, I had a lot of fun sort of with that simple idea of seeing things in almost numerical form. And it helped me to do that. Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see if they want to eat, you know. Well, I'm running out of notes here, so we'll stop soon on that. But the other thing that you learn are some little things that I picked up. You know, I worked for a guy once who had worked with Paddy Chayefsky. Now, Paddy Chayefsky, if you know who he is or not, was one of the great writers of the golden era of television and really a great screenwriter. He wrote Network, among other things. And he had a bunch of neat little rules, like you got to kill off Morris the Explainer at the end of the second act. No, I think you got to shoot Morris the Explainer. And what he meant by that was, by the end of the second act, you don't have time to introduce anything new. You don't have any time for any more exposition, and you are, running to the end. The third act is not about new things. It's about a race to the end. Billy Wilder says that, too. It's just about racing to the end. There's a good book that Cameron Crowe did right before Billy Wilder died. The interviews are fun, anecdotal stuff. The best thing is the appendix, and in it, I should have written them down here for us today, are the 11 rules for screenwriters. This was back when they did things in 11s for some reason, and they're really wonderful. You should get that list, and you should read it, because he really knew what he was talking about. And he says a version of what I just said. It's that after the second act, you're racing to the end, racing for the curtain, and nothing else new should happen. You just want to have everything set up so you can go bang to the end. Another thing that Chayefsky used to say, and Wilder says, is if the curtain won't fall, you have to go back to page 10. In other words, you can't just, if you're having a problem ending your movie, or I would say even in your second act, you can't just solve it there. It's usually in your setup. And that brings us back to the idea that setup and architecture are everything. I think before we go to any questions you might have, I would say the other thing that I learned sort of the hard way is, you always want to sit down and write, and there are people who do that. They'll use their first draft as sort of a way to get it down and turn that into an outline. I have found that outlining has just become extremely important to me. And it's almost like the pre-production of screenwriting is your outline. And the more you plan, the better the production is going to go. And every time I ever told myself in an outline, oh, I'll solve that in the writing, well, that was a guaranteed headache for a day, a week, or a month. It was just terrible. So the more you think these things through, the more specific you get about it in an outline form or a treatment form or whatever is good to do. It's almost prepares you to write. And the next thing, of course, is, they always say this, and you don't want to believe it, but it's true, that, writing is rewriting. And I think it helps you to think that you're just going to keep writing this thing. And you are, really. If you have any luck at all, you will keep writing this thing, and you will write it until they expose the film. And then you're stuck. Sometimes you can do a little bit after that. I'm reminded of Peter Shaffer, who wrote Amadeus. He rewrote that for 5 years when it was in production. It kept getting better. And then it came out again recently. They did a revival of it. It's a wonderful play. If you've seen the movie, it's good. But the play is really astounding. And I'm not a big theater fan, but he had rewritten it again. So over 20 years, he rewrote that play. And I think when you see it, you realize, well, the guy worked on it 20 years. It's pretty damn good. But that's probably why, But again, I get back to stamina and ambivalence and courage. I mean, to work on something for 20 years, to care about it that much, and to keep going back to it and say, I'm going to get it better, I'm going to get it better, and refine it, and not lose your way, that takes something. Anyway. Well, since I've talked for an hour, I can't believe it. See, he was right. Anybody want to talk about something else?
Do you have questions?
They just want to eat.
I have an automatic question. It's
Sure.
What do you do physically as a writer? Do you write it longhand? Do you type it? Do you work on a computer?
Oh, I thought you meant how do I spend my day?
Well, I guess that.
Before noon, I do everything I can. No, on a good day, I'll try to. I do think you should write every day. If you can. It's one of those. I finally started writing in journal. And you can't have a fun. That's why journal writing is good. It doesn't matter. I go look at that. Except that I wrote down. But the act of writing things that you write every day, I think hones your skills kind of it makes you good. To answer your question more specifically, the word process is a wonderful thing. And I am a writer who really came of age with the word process. Because I type one screen and push a few things that way because you don't want to change them. So in the old days when I was a runner on the show Taxi before the computers, they would have a guy like me standing at the door and at 1 a.m. you would take over the typing service and you would type this as a corrected document and then you just stop keeping typing. So I love word processors and they're great tools. That said, I think that you can kind of get lost with them too. You can kind of edit forever and change forever. And so sometimes when I'm stuck, I will write by hand. And just to kind of change what I'm doing to get back into it. And the other thing I've been doing lately is I've been avoiding the screenplay form for as long as possible. That is to say, I've actually done outlines and then I have actually written treatments like I used to write in prose, which was something I had stopped doing a long time ago. But to sort of write it in a different way. And I think there's a lot of internalization that goes on. So that by the time you get to the screenplay form, which is its own form, and it's a little structural, you're not sort of just doing that. They used to write treatments. In the old days, you would write a treatment for a screenplay before you wrote a screenplay. The treatments used to be, like 80, 100 pages long. I think this is, I was surprised to hear that. No one does that anymore because no one will read anything. I mean, they want everything done in 2 pages, and you can't really learn much by doing things in 2 pages. You have to explore it in a fuller way, and I think that's why the long treatment idea is not.
Yeah, question up here.
This is something I'm seeing more and more now. I guess I don't notice more and more articles appearing now about that film. Some producer sent me one just there, that says it was entitled Post 9/11 Films of the 1990s. And it lists about real and it talks all about how pressing Starship was to this time and all of it. That huge time, and of course, it certainly wasn't based on the lessons. I think that we deal with, there's a lot of things that develop out of it also, and I think that it's because if you abuse yourself and extrapolate, and I wasn't thinking, gee, I think something like this is happening. It's in the book, or the character in the head. But the German idea, I think that's question. And it's the last of what we call kind of the human series. And he turned it in and published himself. Because the book itself is not so much a story as it is kind of a little about this society and everything. It's a massive act, really does. And yet, I think the interesting thing about it is some of the things he talks about are hard to count. And by the time I was, and what I was really saying was, after Jurassic Park, and we that stuff, we had all the that's and also I had this notion that it would be fun to do a movie like Starship Troopers, and it would be fun to take a premise, and again, you don't know about Starship Troopers or how comics, not serious. Don't tell anybody this about that movie, but there's something funny about that. So I thought it would be fun and audacious. Instead of doing a sort of normal we could do a movie where it was extraordinarily dangerous, and in fact a movie about something, where you deal with it baseless. And I said to him at the time, I think it's a little untouchable, but I'm sure we can get it. I'm sure somebody can do action on the panel, and I'm sure if we could get it, it would be really complicated because it's not a chance to play. And we both, I'm just going to pull up dreams of nice stuff. And the executive kind of looked at us and thought, what are you talking about? So that was it. But the producer, who found that he was not that, actually decided all behind him. And sort of as I often say, you couldn't feel high school shooting more than and no one had that. Everybody no one has ever had that option. So I found myself actually writing something, which was in the book, if you go around, has a real problem, not only the translation, but because it's really written on one, it actually became read by all the guys around it. And, in that process, I was writing that'll change my life, use it. But my premise had always been to do something a little differently. I would say that essentially people will recognize that what I wanted to do was essentially send you to have go to outer space, fight giant bugs, and become and I wanted it to be told in the style of the propaganda movies that were made by the American studios from about 40 to 40. And these movies are like Vaccine and Atlantic and things like that. They have a very similar structure. And actually what I realized was that there's similar to book. The structure is, here's a regular guy. Nothing much is happening. Here's a movie. The war breaks out. He goes to the basic training. They go to the basic training for a long time. They need a tough sergeant. And the tough sergeant sort of beats it all out. And they need a bunch of other guys like that. And by the end, they have been turned into a focus city. And the most fascinating, which is pretty happy, is lessons I'm going to stop your name and make you right with people. And then you're going to be a certain one, which is actually the third act break. And you're going to say, you're going to look in the mirror and see that you're really right about that. But they're nice. And that's why these two stars and troopers, Neil Patrick Harris, he's a wonderful guy, walks out and then, as a SS officer. And it's not an SS uniform of like the future. It's like Star Wars. Right? It's SS right there. So it's in your face, and strangely some people do that. But and the idea finally was that it should be really only it should be ultimately like triumph of the will. And so if you look at it, you'll see that we have all these triumph of the will images there. And I remember when we started casting, I said, well, if we're really triumph of the will, we should cast it on people. I really wanted to cast it. And everybody should be enormously captivated and practicing because this is the time. And a lot of these things really were not, people in, first in this country, let me show you the kids in this country didn't get that. They didn't get, and I think satire doesn't work in this country on that level of filmmaking. But it's now, it's making these articles where people have started to see it and read that into it. And I'm glad that they do that. Next time you guys all look at it, look for my part. I'm the guy who is first one. So, good night, all friends.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much.